There's really two phrases we're saying at the moment. The first is uncertainty. And look, if you're in the markets, this isn't a new word. You know that uncertainty is the word for 2025. But I would also use the phrase status quo because even though President Trump said yesterday that he's going to send those letters out, and for what it's worth, that's a much easier way than going to the Rose Garden and holding up a little card that says here's
Oh, I
what the new
forgot about
tariff
that.
rates. I think what we're going to see is we saw some reporting from Bloomberg News just last night that President Trump was also talking about extending this. So I think the current idea here is that you're going to have a situation where you have President Trump going out there and making threats or making statements that raises headline risk. But subsequently, you're also going to have this idea that we're just going to try and keep the status quo because we don't want to rock the markets. And so I think you are going to see some examples. I think President Trump may pick on a couple of countries or the European Union in particular to try and raise a renewed threat or a headline risk in order to spur negotiations. But I think for the next 3 to 6 months, the markets are going to face this status quo of a 10% baseline plus an extension or plus an exemption or plus a certain additional threshold like we saw with the China agreement. And that should probably stick through the third quarter.
Are these agreements, and really we're just looking at China and the UK, are they actually different or are they just kind of circling back to where we were before all of this trauma unfolded here?
Well, so the China one is mostly status quo from where we were before, but the UK agreement was different because the United Kingdom didn't have a trade deficit with the United States like other certain countries do. So the base case scenario that you should be looking at is a 10% minimum tariff on every country. I mean, look, we heard Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent say if they don't have any trade, tariffs on us, we're not going to have tariffs on them. But this idea of a 10% baseline is something that's usually sticking around at the White House. But then you're also going to see exemptions. For example, automobiles, technology, anybody that can get into the White House is going to be pushing for President Trump to offer exemptions. And we just go back to this idea that if you are going to see sectors that impact consumer prices, so think of things like Apple MacBooks or Amazon or Walmart, like Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was just getting pushed about in the Senate Finance Committee, then you are going to see exemptions, but then there are going to be additional, tariffs for other countries. But we should say that a lot of this depends on negotiations. Bloomberg News reported just 20 minutes ago that Prime Minister Mark Carney said the U.S.-Canada is going well. They reported last night that negotiations with India weren't going so well. So that idea for examples to be made before July 9th could come about.
Okay, I guess we just keep in touch with him.
I hear some skepticism from Paul at this moment.
It feels like we're going to get to a spot kind of where we did last time, which is at the end of the day, it's a lot about nothing. And I think the markets, certainly the equity markets, might be pricing that in with the rebound here. All right, Nathan, for the adults in the room here, what's the next thing from D.C. we should be focusing on here?
So the number one question we've been getting from our clients just this morning is when is the Senate Finance Committee going to release its legislation or its text of President Trump's one big beautiful bill? So if you are an equity investor and you're exposed to the solar industry or the wind industry, this is very important to you because Senator Crapo just last night was saying that things like certain tax credits should be phased out earlier. And we think he was hitting at solar and wind, and others would be extended, which was nuclear and geothermal. Now, obviously, we're still waiting for that text. Now, I think that text is going to come after market close on Friday. I think it's going to come Saturday or Sunday, but keep your eyes out because there is this potential for some, I used to say marijuana stocks have hot sauce. Now I say the solar stocks, they have hot sauce. So these things move around. So definitely keep your eyes out for that. That's probably the next major catalyst you're going to see coming from Washington.
Is that is hot sauce reference is a good thing or a bad thing? Or just spicy? Just stuff happening?
Just spicy. I stole it from our friends over in the ETF space.
Okay, no, fair enough, because the solar sector is just really in a mess based on when the tax credits land when it comes out of the Senate. Do you think the timeline still works?
I do. I think, obviously the senators want to have all this legislation out in the public arena before Juneteenth next week. They're going away for a couple of days. And I think the Senate can eventually get there. They seem to be a little bit more, I'd say, on board. There were still major questions about the deficit, getting the Rand Pauls on the debt ceiling and, the other senators, Ron Johnson's, if you will, on board. But I think they can get there by the 4th of July or maybe even after the 4th of July. We still are thinking an 80% chance this gets done before the August recess.